right. So good day, Dambash, everyone. And for our friends and audience who will be or are celebrating Nowruz, Nowruzawa, Piruzpa. First, some quick announcements. In April, we will have exciting lectures on the Black Box of the Republic, Alawi Kurdish music, and narratives around Yazidi shrines. And on April 5th, we will also welcome Dr. Jonathan Phillips for our annual lecture in Chicago. The lecture, The Life and Legend of the Sultan Saladin, it will take place in the Crown Center on the Loyola University Chicago campus. So if you'll be in that area, please come join us. We just ask that you register for the event online on Eventbrite. And to find out more about our events and academic programs, please visit our website at www.zahrainstitute.org. And you can also follow Zahra Institute on social media, such as Facebook, X, Instagram, and LinkedIn for updates. All right, we'll get started then. Welcome, marhaba. I'm Shahrani, Outreach Coordinator at Zahra Institute. And I'll be introducing you to our guest speaker and help moderate the Q&A after the presentation. And I invite you to type in any questions you might have on the presentations in the chat box. We will get to as many of them as we can after the presentation. And if you need to leave early or just want to rewatch the lecture, a video recording of the lecture will be made available on Zahra Institute's YouTube and Facebook pages within a few days. So today, in celebration of Women's History Month and the upcoming Nowruz, I am excited to welcome Dr. Farangis Ghaderi, who will be speaking on the Untold Kurdish Women's Histories. So some information about our honored guest speaker. Dr. Ghaderi is a Kurdish scholar, lecturer in Gender and Kurdish Studies, and director of the Center for Kurdish Studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies of the University of Exeter, UK. She earned her PhD with a focus on Kurdish studies from the University of Exeter, and her research focuses on Kurdish cultural production, Kurdish women, translation, literary history, and archives. And she has published extensively on these topics. Among her publications are The Literary Legacy of the Ardalan, The Challenges of Writing Kurdish Literary History, Representation, Classification, Periodization, and Uncovering Women's Voices in the History of Kurdish Poetry. She is co-editor of Women's Voices from Kurdistan, which is a collection of translated poems by underrepresented female writers. She is the principal investigator of the Kurdish Digital Archive project at the University of Exeter, and she is also associate editor of Kurdish Studies Journal and a literary translator. Professor, we are very excited to learn from you about Untold Kurdish Women's Histories. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shahreena, and my thanks also to Zahra Institute and all other colleagues who have been organizing this lecture series and for hosting me. And I'd like to take this opportunity also to wish everyone a Nowruz Piroz and happy spring. So I would like to start with a personal reflection and sharing a story and a photo that is very dear to me. Thank you, Shahreena, for helping me with the slide. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a picture of my grandmother, Piroza, the first lady on the right, with her brother Hussein and sisters Ahu and Fatima. My grandmother was a very strong lady. She had brought up her children on her own, looked after the family land, and was the absolute authority in the family. Every summer, we were spending some time in the village at my grandmother's house, and when the women of the family got together, they shared stories, many stories, including their life struggles, which I would overhear as a child. Some of these stories were tragic, reflecting the hard lives that women had, but also reflecting their resilience. And there were other stories, inspiring stories of women who defied patriarchy, women who stood up to oppressive aghas, landlords, and women who helped the poor, stories of resistance and leadership. And I recall that my aunts turned to me saying that they wished they could write their stories. One of my aunts, Amina, who is not in this picture, told me actually many times that if she could write a story, it would be a multi-volume novel. These interactions, such interactions, have shaped my academic interest of looking for the unheard and the invisible. And I'm indebted to these people for inspiring me. My aunts thought that writing down their stories would ensure that they would be remembered. But in my talk today, I will discuss how women who actually wrote down, who published and took very active roles in society are also forgotten, are not remembered, and they're erased from our national memory. Women have been highly marginalized and to some extent even erased in the Kurdish political, intellectual, and cultural history. So I'll be discussing this marginalization and we'll be exploring the other underlying reasons, but also ways to challenge this exclusion and strategies to uncover women's voices. If you could have the next slide, please. So Rukhosh Ali, she interviewed in her book over 100 Kurdish women political activists in Bashur, Iraqi Kurdistan. You might have heard of Bakhtiyar Ali, a very famous Kurdish novelist. Rukhosh was his sister, but is not as known as Bakhtiyar. She put it starkly, saying that women are not just marginalized, but are also erased from the margins. They're forgotten both as women and revolutionaries. Here, the forgotten women that Ali interviewed were members of Kurdish revolutionary movements and parties in Kurdistan. So their erasure is actually at odds with the movement's ideology of liberation and equality. The omission of women, however, is extended to cultural and intellectual histories. So for instance, the history of Kurdish literature is virtually immense history, and Kurdish women's contribution to the development of Kurdish literature has been discussed as a recent phenomenon and noticeable only from the last decades of the 20th century. In fact, a glance at the Kurdish literary historiographies, anthologies, and primary source materials on Kurdish literature reveal this exclusion. If you can have the next slide, please. And next. Yeah, thank you. So the most revealing source, I believe, is Maruf Khaznadar's 7-volume Mejri Adabi Kurdi, the Kurdish literary history, which is one of the most comprehensive accounts of Kurdish literature, which covers Kurdish literature from the medieval periods to 1975. This multi-volume collection has over 160 entries on poets and writers, of which only 3 are women. These volumes have become primary source materials for research and teaching Kurdish literature and have subsequently contributed to the general conception of women's writing as a late phenomenon. Women are also non-existent in foundational publications on Kurdish literature and Kurdish literary criticism, pretty much till the late 80s. They're non-existent. Women are also highly underrepresented in anthologies of Kurdish literature. And again, from the very first Kurdish anthology published in 1920 till anthologies that were published much later, recent one. One of the seminal anthologies is Mehmet Ozon's anthology Adabiyat Kurdi, which was published in 1990. It includes just one woman, Asma Ocak, out of 104 entries. And next slide, please. And so this, unsurprisingly, this omission has been reproduced in translations of Kurdish poetry, in translation into European languages, but Persian, Turkish, Arabic as well. In a study that Clemence Calvert-Ugel and I conducted on English translations of Kurdish literature, this is what we noted, that women were highly marginalized in anthologies and single authored volumes. as you can see in this table. This study was published in 2021. Next slide. So, I mean, the reasons. The exclusion of women's intellectual and creative writing, of course, in history is a global phenomenon. And it's not, the Kurdish case is by no means an exception. But for Kurdish women, as well as patriarchy, which is a global phenomenon, complex webs of inclusion that include statelessness, political and linguistic suppression, the hegemony of the state languages, Kurdish political and linguistic fragmentation, and the power relation between Kurdish languages or dialects and the marginalization of the smaller linguistic groups have compounded their dominated status. Under the repressive conditions in Turkey, Syria, and Iran, as scholar Amir Hassanpour noted, a significant portion of Kurdish literary heritage was destroyed, especially those, he reminds us, those in private possession. Indeed, memoirs of Kurdish intellectuals, literati, and politicians in the 20th century, 20th and 21st century, are replete with accounts of the destruction of Kurdish books and records by state actors, but also by Kurds themselves, out of the fear of persecution. And among these works that were destroyed were inevitably Kurdish women's writing. Next slide. In an interview with Dia Joan, one of the most celebrated poets of Rojava, she sadly passed away recently. This interview was conducted jointly with two other colleagues. She recalled that when her poetry collection, first poetry collection, Pelek Shadaria Kovan and Men, Away from the Sea of My Sorrows, when it was published in 1992 in Syria, she was arrested and interrogated several times, and her book was consequently destroyed. And her next poetry collection had the same fate. The power relation of Kurdish languages or dialect linguistic varieties, however you name it, has also contributed to the marginalization of women. Kurdish literary histories and anthologies, they have written and discussed this elsewhere, actually in a few pieces. Kurdish literary history, as well as anthologies, present an incomplete picture of Kurdish literature because they often, in these anthologies and literary histories, Shahrani and Kurmanji dominate, and other languages are either excluded or noticeably marginalized. So Kurdish women who write in Gorani / Horami, Zazaki, and Southern Kurdish face a double marginalization. In 2019, the KRG Ministry of Culture and Youth published an anthology, Jinjian Denusetawa, Women Write Life. This was published, this anthology was put together to celebrate Kurdish women's poetry, but also to challenge the exclusion from the canon. However, the featured poets in this volume are overwhelmingly Shahrani. This anthology includes 73 Shahrani poets, Shahrani women poets, only 7 Badini poets, 1 Gorani, no poets in Zazaki or Southern Kurdish. And as for patriarchy, like most societies, there are many ways that patriarchy has played out in the Kurdish context, which includes stigma and social punishment for daring to write, sing, perform, or to be in the public eyes. Interviewing women political activists in Bashur, including those who experienced imprisonment for their political activism under the Ba'ath regime, Rukhosh Ali, who I cited at the beginning of this talk, noted that women, I quote, did not fear the prison and the torture of the Ba'ath as much as they feared traditions and societal norms, the Abu Narid. So also more subtle ways of denigrating women's work, for example, questioning their authorships. There are examples of this in Kurdish literature as other literary traditions, and also questioning the literary and aesthetic qualities. Ioana Ross has a great book. It's a slim but very sharp book entitled "How to Suppress Women's Writing." And she has illustrated how women's works in all literary traditions were deemed lacking in aesthetic complexity and political importance. Women also may have contributed or have contributed and facilitated their marginalization and invisibilization, as women are less likely to promote their works and talk about their contributions. Sinead McCall, Irish scholar who worked to record Irish women's diverse form of activism from 1916 to 1923, illustrated that the conventional gender norms for women worked to ensure that women would stay silent about their parts in the struggle for freedom. Therefore, they were overlooked, or one of the reasons, at least, that they were overlooked. In an interview that I had with Nermin Osman, who had published 2 impressive volumes of interviews with Kurdish women activists, including those women who were involved in the covert underground political activism. She told me that these 2 volumes are fantastic because they are really very important intervention in the field. She told me that most of the women she talked to were reluctant to be interviewed because they didn't think that they had anything of significance or interesting to share. And this was really fascinating. So she had to convince them that their stories was worth being told and recorded and documented. Now, with this general overall understanding of some of the reasons for the exclusion of Kurdish women in the canon, now the question is where to look to uncover Kurdish women's voices. Here I share, if we move to the next slide, please, my strategies where I've been looking and what I've found helpful, fruitful. So I've been looking into archives. I've been examining early Kurdish periodicals and publications, and manuscripts, and to a limited extent oral history. So I'll try to give an example for each. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So a substantial portion, I may have mentioned already, a substantial portion of Kurdish records and documents are lost or destroyed. And of course, this is well documented. But the good news is that a significant part has also survived. And over the past decades, in particular, initiatives have been founded to uncover, collect, preserve Kurdish records. And this is in the absence of national archive, a national Kurdish archive. We don't have a Kurdish national library or national Kurdish archive. But these initiatives, different initiatives have amassed in Kurdistan and also abroad. They have amassed dispersed archival repositories. And while some of them, for instance, Jean Center for Art Documentation and Research in Bashur, some of these initiatives have received limited public funding. They are primarily personal initiatives, constituting what I call archival activism. Now we can talk about, actually, this deserves a lecture of its own, the Kurdish archives, where are they, the status. But suffice to say that there are a significant number of archives, large or small, but also there are a significant number of private archives in Kurdistan. And I will mention a couple of them. And to challenge women's erasure, we need to look at archives. Archives in its broadest definition. Private family archives I will illustrate, are as significant as the larger ones, if not more significant actually. And in studying or locating archives, we need to adopt a comprehensive and multilingual approach. It's absolutely vital we have a multilingual approach in uncovering Kurdish records. Kurdish manuscripts and records have been located in libraries in Iran, in national libraries in Iran, Iraq, Turkey, in the United Kingdom, Germany, Russia, among others. And a significant portion of the Kurdish written literature has remained as unpublished manuscript, scattered across national libraries in the region, in Kurdistan, or in Europe, as I noted. And over the last decades, actually, the discovery of some new manuscript have also led to uncovering Kurdish women's poets and Kurdish women's voices. I believe the most celebrated discovery has been the uncovering and the publication of Kurdish poems of Mahsharaf Khanim Mastura Ardalan, a poet and a historian, a scholar who previously was known to have only written in Persian. But a more complete collection of her Kurdish poem was published only in 2011. And this was following the discovery of a manuscript in Berlin Library. Now, although Mastura has been uncovered and celebrated, she's actually really celebrated all over Kurdistan in different parts, but she's often referred to as an exception. But an argument against this exceptionality actually lies within the same manuscript in the Berlin Library. Mamsa Muhammad Ali Qaradaghi, who published this 2011 Diwan of Mastura, very helpfully also printed or published along with the Diwan the actual manuscript that he drew this new Diwan on. And in this manuscript, we find a poem which is, can we move to the next slide, please? Here's the poem in the same manuscript, the same kashkol, which included, it was a large kashkol that included some Kurdish poets, including new poems or less known poems of Mastura. But there is also a poem which is not Mastura's, but it's the inscription says Kalam Sultan Khanam است. So this is this was a poet named Sultan Khanam, and the poem is an elegy for Khosrow Khan, Mastura's husband and the ruler of Ardalan. And the poet ends the elegy by closing with her pen name Izzat. Now, Mastura's Diwan also includes an elegy for Sultan Khanam. In examining these two poems, it became clear to me that Sultan Khanam was Khosrow Khan's Ardalan's sister, so Mastura Ardalan's sister-in-law. But the only other source that mentions a poet named Sultan Khanam is Sadiq Safizadeh Borakei, suggesting these dates that you see, but doesn't offer any further information. And although we haven't yet found more poems by Sultan Khanam yet, the quality of this single poem testifies that she was an adept poet. And it's reasonable, I argue, it's reasonable to presume that if one poem, she wrote such a quality poem, and this one poem had ended up in an anthology that had ended up at Berlin National Library, she must have written more poems that are lost to us, but may come to light in future. So examining manuscript and public and private archives are highly likely to bring more women's voices to light. Moving on to periodicals, thank you. So exploring early Kurdish periodicals also revealed the forgotten contributions of Kurdish women to literature, but also to public debates. While Kurmanji periodicals, I believe they're fairly studied. There are a number of good scholarly works on early Kurmanji periodicals, but surprisingly, early Sorani periodicals have remained largely unexplored. And women in this periodical, when you go through them, you find women's work, but with pen name. So women adopted pen names such as Kıça Kurd, a Kurdish girl or Kurdish daughter, or Daikiki Kurd, a Kurdish mother. And although studying, I mean, these periodicals are undigitized, Binkei Gene Institute for Documentation and Research have a very helpfully collected. I think they have one of the most comprehensive records and collection of Sorani, as well as Kurmanji, but for Sorani in particular, the collection of these periodicals. They're undigitized, so studying them is challenging and quite straining to eyes, reading through them, but they remain nonetheless an indispensable source for uncovering women's voices. And actually to challenge and transform our understanding of cultural production, I believe, early 20th century. Here, I found this editorial really illuminating. So this was published. This is Jian paper, Jian number 467, and published on 8 February 1926. And here is my translation of the editorial. Note the beauty and grace, Jamalu Kamal, of goddesses who, under the fetters of the harsher sex, jinsi khashan, has taken the little opportunity of education, and with the little literacy that they have acquired, they have become the fire of poetry and literature, and the writing of some of these women, no one can deny, is of higher quality than men. But they have not had the boldness to bring them to the arena. So this is quite fascinating. From the same paper from Jian, next slide, please. We actually not only a few issues later, following this editorial, we learn about two women who made significant contributions to women's education. So the argument and the discussion on women's education, but actual contribution to women's education in Bashur in Kurdistan. Nonetheless, they are forgotten. Zahra Mulki and Gozide Mulki, daughter and daughter-in-law of Mustafa Pasha Mulki, the chairman of the Ottoman military court, who returned to Kurdistan, to Suleymania, and became the Minister of Education in Sheikh Mahmoud's second cabinet. You have probably have heard of Anjum Mulki, who founded Kurd Kadinlari Ta'ali Jamiyati, the Society for the Advancement of Kurdish Women, in 1919 in Istanbul. Zahra was her younger sister. Zahra founded the first girls' school in Suleymani in 1926, and we learned this studying Jian. And she also directed the first play by female student that we know of, and this was apparently in competition with the boys' school. The boys' school had staged a play that was received well, excellent by the city, by the people. And she thought, why not us? We can also stage a play, and she did, and it was received well. And in Jian, we also find Zahra's opening speech of this play, which is fascinating. Gozida was the manager of the principal of the school. The school was named after Zahra and was called Zahra School. Gozida was a principal, but she also, we find an article by her, an impressive article on women's education in Jian, published on 22nd of April, 1926. I like to just cite a short excerpt from this article because it's really fascinating. And the language and the argument, the kind of argument she presented reminds one of what Afsan and Najmabadi called educating the wombs. I quote, "Women give birth to men and nurture them and can lead them to civilization and progress." So madaniyatan taraqi, these are the words. For Kurdish nation to exist and prosper, Kurdish women need to be educated. Women manage not just homes, but homeland. They establish the life. They establish the life of the nation and homeland. Millet uwatan, so the word used. And I'm happy to share that I have recently secured access and permission to digitize Yamulki's family archive, where these photos are found, and this will be digitized and made accessible on our digital Kurdish archive website at the University of Exeter. Examining early Kurdish publication and books is also instrumental. Access to Kurdish books, even recently published one, is often difficult and due to political constraints, the small print runs of publication, but also the lack of an effective circulation system. Next slide, please. In 2020, I came across a book, a poetry collection, as you see on the left, Biri Chespel, Unwavering Idea, published 1973 by Samia Shakir Chaushli. I found this at the Jin Archival Center. I could only find two sources referring to Samia, one published in 1983 and the other online newspaper piece published in 2019, which actually helped me to track Samia, and through contacting the writer, I managed to find Samia's contact number, and I finally met this remarkable woman in 2023 after almost 2 years of communication over the phone. Samia was a teacher, poet, an active member of Iraqi Communist Party, Hizb Shuyu'i, and a member of Legislative Council, Majlis Tashri'i, from 1974 to 1979. In 1979, she had to flee Iraq to avoid arrest, and she relocated to Germany, the city of Leipzig, where she began her academic journey. So she started life from scratch, and she studied at the University of Leipzig, where she completed her undergrad, master's, and PhD in sociology. And she was hired by the same university, and she taught there for 17 years. In exile, she published her second poetry collection, Bahridur, Exiled Thoughts, in 1983, along her academic work, so both books and articles on Kurdish women in German. Her academic publications are mostly in German. And she also published translations from Arabic to Kurdish. So it's really fascinating or astonishing or unbelievable that a prolific woman like her that has worked and been active in so many spheres, political, cultural, academic, has remained unknown. Currently, I'm working, if we move to the next slide, I'm working with her to digitize her works and her photos as part of our digital Kurdish archive. These photos actually are at the moment part of the photos that are accessible on the website. The open access. When she was younger, she was a keen photographer, so she has fascinating collections of photos. The photos that you see here are from her time at teacher training, Dar al-Muallimi, teacher training college in Baghdad, 1950, mid-1950s. And one of the the picture on the left is actually 1955, where you see, I don't know if you can notice, there is a lady visibly older than the rest of the students. She had her jacket over her shoulders. That's the biology teacher, Nahida Rafiq Hilmi. Now, Nahida herself is a fascinating woman. She won in 1949. She won a postgraduate scholarship to study in the United States, she was a globetrotter. So she traveled all around the world, and she wrote wrote back and published her travel writing. Nevertheless, she has remained forgotten, together with her sister, also, Dr. Pakiza Rafiq Hilmi. Very briefly, I mentioned her. She was a linguist, literary critic, educator, and most importantly, the founder of the Kurdish Language and Literature Department in Baghdad University in 1959. And it's astonishing that they have Dr. Pakiza Rafiq Hilmi has almost been erased from literary history, Kurdish literary history, despite her significant contribution. So far, the examples that I gave were traceable in the archives. But now the question is, how do we trace voices that do not appear in the archives? Voices that have been rendered invisible. And this is a task in Spivak words of measuring silences. Here, I believe we need to further interrogate archives and archival practices. What are deemed worthy of preserving, of digitizing, of passing on. And here I also believe oral history and ethnography become significant tools. And I share a final example of one woman with a remarkable history and contribution, yet being rendered invisible, where I located through personal contact and learning from her on oral history. Next slide, which will be the last one. Thank you. Khadija Mustafa Hawezi, better known as Farishta Koi, or Khushka Farishta, Sister Farishta, was an active member of Hizb Shi'i, Iraqi Communist Party. And although she didn't have a formal education, so not literacy, she didn't have formal literacy, she was known to be a great, passionate speaker. So she was elected as the member of Iraqi women delegation in 1959, attending communist conferences and meetings all around the world, or in communist countries. I reached out with the help of a friend to her family in Koya, and they generously shared her photo album and photos of her travels with me. Again, they will be digitized and made accessible with the family's permission on the website, on Digital Kurdish Archive website. What's also fascinating about Farishta Khan, is that she expressed her ideology, her ideas, and the account of her travels in poetry. But she would recite poetry. She would recite this and narrate poetry, and a family member would write them down. And her family had collected a handful of her poems and printed them in a pamphlet, really just for circulation within the family. And I have a copy of this, but it wasn't circulated widely. So she's not outside, perhaps, the family circle in Koya. She's not known. And it's worth remembering or noting that she was the sister of Ahmed Dilzar and Karim Shahraza. Those who are familiar with Kurdish literature know that Ahmed Dilzar and Karim Shahraza are two well-canonized poet, writer, and critic. So her brothers are well-canonized, but she has remained unknown. And in conclusion, coming to conclusion, so identifying patterns of suppression of Kurdish women's voices and the mechanism of these exclusions are crucial for challenging their historical omission. But it's not enough. It's not enough as long as women's works and contribution remain hidden and unknown. As Ioana Ross rightly pointed out, I quote, "When the memory of one's predecessors is buried, the assumption persists that there were none, and each generation of women believes itself to be faced with the burden of doing everything for the first time. To uncover lost women's voices, it is vital to investigate archives and identify and examine manuscripts, periodical publications, oral history, as I tried to show with some examples. And while building digital archives, archives in general, but also digital archive are significant, are important. We need more means, other means and measures to remedy women's historical invisibilization and exclusion, including a curriculum change that perhaps I could elaborate on in the Q&A. I think I have a slide of our website, Shahreena, no, okay. I can share a link to the website. It's open access, as I said. And some of the photos that I showed you today are available here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Professor, for an informative and inspiring presentation. Let's see here if we have any questions in the chat box. I invite you all to enter your question or questions in the chat box. You are also welcome to raise your hand via Zoom directly. While waiting for the questions to populate, I'll start off with a question that's maybe of interest to our general audience, which is for individuals interested in learning but cannot yet read Kurmanji or Shahrani or the various dialects of Kurdish. What are titles of few books or articles that can help provide some background information on Kurdish literary history that in English that you can recommend?
Yeah, I can share some titles. There are a number of PhD dissertation, actually. I think around 8 PhD dissertation were done at the University of Exeter on different parts, different aspects of Kurdish literature. Kurmanji, Shahrani, and Badini literature. That can, I think some of them are now accessible. A couple of them, there is a dissertation by Salman Hassan on women poets. Women poets in Bashur. That is published, so it's accessible. But there are a number of overall understanding articles that will help with overall understanding of Kurdish literature, Kurdish novel. There are a number of articles, studies on Kurdish poetry. I have published an article, The History of Kurdish Poetry. Is an account of Kurdish poetry from classical and modern. That's part of the Cambridge History of Kurds. Yeah, and I can also there are some studies on Gorani, I think, as well. The Dr. Behrut Shamanara has published on Shahnama, which I can again share a link to, and also some articles on Gorani epic poetry.
Thank you, Professor. All right, let's see. Anyone has questions here or want to start off?
Hi, this is Connie. I just wanted to share one thing. Thank you so much for your lecture. I do have a book. I don't know if anyone's seen it or heard of it. My brother actually found it online for me. It's called Kurdish Women's Stories. It is, I believe, it's more of a, she was going around getting people's stories, so they didn't write it themselves, but I just wanted to share that in case anybody, I will give a caveat that I didn't get so far through. Most of them are from, I think, about Seymaniya, Hawler, and they are somewhat depressing, which is maybe the theme, but I did want to share it in case anyone wanted to find it.
Thanks.
Hi, Shahreena, I have a question.
And go ahead, Salfa.
Hope all is well. Thank you so much for this lecture. It's really important to know that the academic community needs to dig into the archives because most of the archives are forgotten unless there is a political reason for that. But my question to you as a researcher, like how can you connect your discoveries with the feminist movement of Kurdish women? I mean, if there are aspects of oppression in Kurdish society, why in the academe we're not talking about feminist movements of Kurdish women and really unraveling all these discrepancies in their history and also bringing attention to how they were excluded?
Thank you very much for your question.
Sure.
There are a number of studies that like feminist intervention. I have here the recent book of Shahrzad Mojab with me, The Kurdish Women Through History, Culture and Resistance, which is a series, I think 14 chapters, excellent work, mostly by Kurdish women, which is fascinating. This is following her a seminal book, Women of Non-Nation State, that was published in 2000, I think, or 2001. Some of your concerns, I think, are addressed in this by chapters by colleagues in this book, as well as the first volume, but this book in particular. For me, what I have seen, through this uncovering, through archival research, what I've come to find, of course, this is not something new for Kurdish. There is an indigenous movement, woman movement, that we need to acknowledge. Women's activism, actually, in Kurdistan, and I believe, I can't say for certainty for the Middle East, but in Kurdistan actually predates Western feminism or Western ideas of feminism. I mentioned just a couple of names, such as Zahra Yamulki, Guzida Yamulki, Anjum Yamulki, who Anjum founded the first Kurdish Women's Association, Women's Society in Istanbul in 1919. And when you look at the constitution is now available, I think in English translation as well. It's really remarkable what the ideas and aims that this society had. It wasn't, I mean, women's education, elevation of women's, Kurdish women's status was part of it, but it wasn't all. They were like tackling so many levels, so many areas in societies, including poverty, including mass education. So that's my observation, that of course women in Kurdistan have been inspired by feminist movement around the world, as we have seen, especially I think that has been brought to our attention over the last decade. But also there is an indigeneity in the women's movement that we need to pay more attention to and acknowledge more.
Thank you so much. I'm really interested in the indigeneity aspect, not really copying the Western ideals and Western movements. I would really appreciate it if you could give another lecture on the indigeneity of feminism in among Kurdish women.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zahra. Thank you, Professor. And there's a question here in the chat box from Jeanette. She wrote, "Thank you for a great talk. I'm wondering how you balance the specifics of open access digital publishing with closed copyright issues. How often are you able to convince families or copyright holders or state archive actors to publish materials openly?"
Mhm. So far, we have managed to secure access and permission to digitize. Not everything, but I work closely with the families, with the owners of these collections, to decide what they. Anything that's are made accessible is done with a consent and in consultation with them, and also the creation of the metadata. If you look at our website, the website is multilingual, is in English, Kurdish, and Arabic. And creation of the metadata is a significant part of the work. That creation of that metadata is done also in consultation with the copy holders. I give you an example of, for instance, while working with Samia on her digitizing her photo albums, sometimes she had reservation. So the photos are fantastic because we don't have actually, at least yet we don't know, we don't have many photos from, for instance, the Dar al-Muallimin in Baghdad, Teachers Training College, which actually there were many Kurdish women in that training in the college. And Samia's pictures are key to identifying more women. But she had concerns that because of time and because she's not in contact with this family or with her colleagues, her friends, or maybe some of them have passed away, and maybe the families would not be pleased to see them in a very specific, as you saw, costume or dress. So we have decided the one that we have put on the website are done in consultation with her. And also we have a very clear takedown policy. So even if we are given permission by copy holders to make accessible certain documents, photos, anytime that they change their mind, they let us know, and we'll take them down. Or if we receive, again, that's clearly cited on our website in English, Kurdish, and Arabic, that if anyone has concern and they think that there is a document that is theirs and we don't hold a copy and we shouldn't be posting them, hosting them, we will review that request or query or complaint, and we'll take them down. But I mean, you're right. That's a tricky question or issue ongoing, and we need to respect. We have to respect, of course, the copy holders and the families' wishes in making these materials accessible. I think it's important to have them accessible because at the moment they're not. You don't need, for instance, logging, authentication. You don't need to be associated with a university or institution, higher education institution. Anyone, any member of public in Kurdistan and beyond can access them, and I think that's important. But we will obviously be continue working with the copy holders in making this accessible or not.
Thank you, Professor. Looks like here Shanar Osman has a question and comment. Dr. Ghaderi provided very important information. I thank you very much. Also to the Zahra Institute, there is almost no representation of women in Kurdish contemporary art. Have you done any work on the subject, or is there any?
Is that a question for you or for me?
I think that is a question for you, if you've done any work on contemporary women in Kurdish contemporary art. Shenar is a contemporary artist.
I haven't done on contemporary. My work have largely focused on classical and early 20th, so far up to late 20th century. But on art, there are actually a couple of contribution in the same book that I showed you by Shahrzad, the new book, Kurdish Women Through History, Culture, and Resistance. I will put a link to it, by other colleagues who have been working on performance, and there is a particular one. Yeah, there is a piece by Hozan Mahmoud and Isabel Kaiser, the Four Pillars of Loneliness, Women's Artistic and Cultural Production in Southern Kurdistan. And I think there are other pieces that addresses your question. So I recommend looking into this newly published source.
Thank you. Other questions here? Mujahid, your mic is on.
Yeah, I guess I would like to ask a question. Thank you very much. That was very informative. And it's very interesting how interest in uncovering really leads to discovery of a lot of hidden treasures, especially in terms of women's writing. My question has to do with the popular tendency. Sometimes people are over enthusiastic in claiming that Kurdish women are, some sort of Kurdish women exceptionalism, that Kurdish women are more, almost by nature more progressive and so on. Or how do you respond to those kind of claims, especially given that you're more interested in critique of patriarchy and so on? Thank you.
That's the question that actually I'm still exploring, to be honest. I think it has some valid points, those arguments. I think it needs much more investigation. I've been thinking that really to go deep into this question, explore it, we need a group of scholars coming together and studying and examine. I mean, there have to be people from archaeologists, linguists, literary critics, really to answer that question. It can't be one person's endeavor. But I mean, this is by no means a conclusion. This is so far just observation from what I've seen, what I observed. And as I said, it needs further investigation. There are, I think we can definitely see some remnants of a different system. I mean, other than patriarchy. I don't think patriarchy has always been the only system known. Not just for Kurds, I think generally in the region. I think there are some studies doing that, looking at that in larger Mesopotamia, in Turkey. I think there are some interesting studies looking at matriarchy, looking at a different system, and I think there are. Maybe not all parts of Kurdistan, of course, we're talking about a large geography, but I think that we can see remnants of a different kind of system that just doesn't you can't count for it, with the patriarchal system that is in place now. But the question that I have, and I think it will be many years exploring, is since when, if this is the case, since when that changed, and why and how that changed. That's a question I think it's worth noting. But a different kind of system, I don't think Kurds are exception. actually you can see, you know, and I think there are some studies now in Africa, also in I think different parts of the world, really looking at the different kind of system before patriarchy, questioning that patriarchy was not always the norm. And this shift, there was a shift, for instance, in parts of India, and colonialism had an impact. It had an impact. Modernity, the advance of modernity, had an impact. But also other socio-economic, social changes that happened that changed the system. But I don't have an answer. Only thing that I think there was a different, patriarchy was not always the norm, and we have clear examples of that. This, you know, sometimes you see stories of, as you said, a glorification of women's, you know, the role of certain political parties in empowering women. Again, I mean, that is partly true, but also there must be potentials for that empowerment. So it must build, if there is an empowerment, that can't be built on void. It has to be built on a background.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I think, if I may add, you know, capturing Kurdish specificity is very important, rather than just applying a formulaic, you know, explanation, ignoring geographical, cultural, historical particularisms of each culture, without falling into the trap of, you know, self-glorification and so on. It's a difficult balance to achieve, but I see your work is in the right direction. Personally, I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you very much.
Many thanks.
Professor, there's another question that was sent to me directly, but I think it's meant for you. Have you taken steps to publish a book or series that examines the history of the women's movement in all parts of Kurdistan and globally, specifically focusing on the role of Kurdish women, while also addressing the stolen and largely untold history of the Kurds? Oh, that's a heavy, big questions there.
Yeah, that cannot be, thank you so much for your comments, question. That cannot be one person's mission. But for me, yes, this is a book project. I don't know how many years it will take me to finally, you know, this materialize. But I think it's difficult for me. It's because I think you really need field work. You really need some ethnography. It's you really need to examine archives, and for archives, one issue we have is that we don't know how many archives we have. We don't know where we have archives. Every time that I go to Kurdistan, I learn about a new collection. So contrary to the assumption, and I hear this a lot from colleagues, especially in Kurdistan, that everything is lost, everything was destroyed, and there's nothing has been left. But that's actually not the case. A lot has survived and are left to scholars, but there is no net. We don't know what we have, and there's no network between these collections, archives, these personal initiatives, both in Kurdistan and beyond. So you need going deep into this collections, whatever are available, accessible. So I think you probably noticed that even the example they gave were mostly focused on Bashur, Iraq, Kurdistan, because that's a place that I've had access to, and I've been able to do field work, to do a very comprehensive historical account. I don't know if I will be able to do that. I doubt it. because, as I said, yeah, you need to be in the field, and you need to do really deep work. You can't do it from the desktop, in libraries.
Thank you. And Mustafa, it looks like you have comments. Would you like to say them aloud, or would you like me to read them?
Yeah, I wrote them. I don't know if anyone's heard of this historian, but he has a lot of different Islamic history, but one of his lectures are just on the evolution of gender. And it basically talks about how genders were basically equal until farming, and farming led to war, and then war led to men needing to be bigger. And anyways, it's a 2-hour lecture, but I wanted to share that. The other thing I thought is very interesting is just because, from an outsider, or regionally, when you talk to Arabs and Turks and even Iranians, anytime you mention Kurds, it's like, whoa, those are the warrior people. Those are the strong people. I hear it all the time. And yet when you're in the culture and you're talking to a woman who's, the wife in a village, she doesn't feel that. So it's just so interesting that the writings don't really reflect, I guess, how the region views Kurdish women. So I don't know if you have noticed that maybe in the poetry or the writings or the archives that you've been looking at. Is there a discrepancy between the reputation of Kurdish women regionally versus individual writings?
Thank you. I completely get your point, and you're right. But there's also, I think, that reputation is built based on something. It's not just imagination and fabrication. However, the point that you made, I think we need to try avoiding generalization, as well as essentialization, of course. But generalization is something that we need to avoid. What are the women in the village? What are the villagers? I have actually heard stories. So now I ask women in my family, my mom, my aunts, tell me stories, interesting stories of inspiring women, and usually, as Nermin Osman I mentioned, she mentioned that the women were reluctant to share their stories because they didn't think that they were worthy. They didn't think they were interesting. So usually the response at the beginning is, oh, nothing, all were badbakhtu, becharo, everyone was, oppressed, women were oppressed. But then, they sometimes I remember, I was a story that was shared with me recently was one of my mother's cousin, Humaira. She was so fierce, so strong, that her house was the only house that did refuse to pay tax to the agha, to the landlord. The agha's men didn't dare to go to her house because she would beat them up. And very interestingly, it doesn't end this fascinating story. She then would give away the tax, the crop, the tax, agha's tax, to the poor. And I believe there must be more stories of like that. However, they because and this is something that I try to be attentive to, and I think about it often. Am I writing an elitist history? Because the women that I mentioned all were educated, highly educated in the public eyes. What about the women who were not educated, who couldn't, like my aunts, who could not write or share the stories, but nevertheless were strong figures, were leaders in their communities? Their stories are often missed, are overlooked, even by historians, even by academics. And it's very difficult, of course, to trace them, because it's not like, Samia's book I could find in an archive. Even though they were overlooked, they were ignored for a long time, Nevertheless, there are some traces. But the question I pose at the end, what do we do when the voices, there are no traces of voices in the archive? How do we deal with that silence or those silences? This is a methodological question that I grapple with.
Thank you, Professor. And we have a lot of work ahead here in uncovering women's voices. Thank you so much. This was very informative and, like I said before, very much inspiring. So right now we're going to conclude our Q&A section. As previously mentioned, if you would like to rewatch a lecture or you'd like to watch the video recording of this lecture, you can watch it on our Facebook and YouTube pages within a few days. So spas, thank you, terima kasih, Professor, and all of our audience members for your support and attendance. We hope to see you at our next Zoom speaker event, or hopefully even at our annual lecture in Chicago. Again, Norozawa Pirosba, Bhatrawa. Bye.
Thank you very much. Zoza spas.
Thank you, Professor.
Pirot.